You work 5 days, you rest 2. Monday through Friday, Saturday and Sunday off. Who decided that? And why not 4 days or 6 or some completely different split that nobody today would even recognize? The 5 day workweek wasn't handed down from some ancient consensus about human nature or the rhythms of the sun. It was hammered out through factory fights, religious compromise, and one automaker's very calculated bet. And for a long time, a completely different schedule looked like it was going to win. To understand where the 5 day week came from, you first have to understand what it replaced, and what it replaced was genuinely brutal. In industrial Britain and the United States through the 1800s, a 6 day workweek was the floor, not the ceiling. Most factory workers, mill hands, and laborers put in anywhere from 10 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was the one protected day, guarded not by any labor law but by religious convention, the Christian Sabbath, enshrined in the social fabric of the time. That was the entire arrangement. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest, and if you didn't like it, there were 50 people behind you willing to take your place. The first serious crack appeared not from workers themselves, but from a specific and deeply pragmatic problem employers began to notice in the late 19th century. Exhausted workers made mistakes, broke equipment, and produced worse goods. In 1890, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics published data showing that average manufacturing workers were logging over 60 hours a week. Productivity per hour was actually declining as hours increased past a certain threshold. The logic of endless hours was starting to eat itself. Labor organizers had been making this argument for decades, of course. The 8-hour movement, with its famous rallying cry of 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, had been building since the 1860s, but employers largely ignored it until the economic math became impossible to dismiss. The tension that would define the next 50 years was already visible. Workers wanted less time in the factory, owners wanted more output from it, and neither side had yet found the arrangement that would satisfy both. The event that bent the trajectory of the workweek into an entirely new shape had almost nothing to do with productivity arguments or labor organizing. It had to do with Saturday, and with religion, specifically, the religious practice of Jewish workers in the textile mills and garment factories of New England and New York. By the early 1900s, large numbers of Jewish immigrant workers observed the Sabbath from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. This created a genuine operational problem for factory owners. Workers would need to leave early on Fridays or miss Saturday shifts entirely. In some mills in New England, particularly in Massachusetts and Connecticut, factory managers began quietly experimenting with a Saturday half-day, or in some cases a full Saturday off, to accommodate their workforce without constant absenteeism and friction. This wasn't idealism, it was logistics. The result was something unexpected. When Saturday was treated as a half-day or a rest day, output on Friday actually increased. Workers who knew they had a full weekend coming pushed harder to clear their work before it arrived. Absenteeism on Mondays dropped. The anecdotal evidence was accumulating factory floor by factory floor that a shorter week might not mean less production, but this was still scattered, informal, confined to specific industries and regions. No one had made it a principle yet. The country still ran on 6 days. The question hanging in the air by about 1910 was whether anyone with enough weight would actually commit to the experiment, and whether it would spread or stay a quiet accommodation in a few northeastern mills. The lock-in moment came not from a government, not from a union victory, and not from a court ruling. It came from Henry Ford. In 1926, Ford Motor Company officially moved its manufacturing plants to a 5-day, 40-hour workweek. Ford's River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, then the largest integrated industrial complex in the world, employing over 75,000 workers, went to Monday through Friday, with Saturday and Sunday completely off. Ford announced this not reluctantly but triumphantly. His public reasoning was striking. Workers who had leisure time would spend money on leisure. They would buy cars, they would buy goods, they would become the consumers that kept the industrial economy moving. The 5-day week wasn't charity, it was, in Ford's framing, a demand stimulus. The business press was skeptical, competitors called it reckless, but Ford's output numbers held and in some categories improved because the company had simultaneously reorganized workflows to compensate for the shorter week. When a company of Ford's scale and visibility made the move and didn't collapse, the psychological barrier for other manufacturers dropped significantly. The formal legal anchor came 13 years later. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, established 40 hours as the threshold beyond which overtime pay was required. It didn't ban a longer workweek, it made one more expensive. Employers now had a financial incentive to keep their workers at or under 40 hours, which in practice meant 5 8-hour days. The law didn't invent the 5-day week, Ford had already planted that flag, but it made the economics point in only one direction. By the early 1940s, the five-day week was effectively the national standard, not by mandate but by math. Here is what almost won instead. Through the 1930s, as the Depression gutted employment across the United States, a serious and well-supported movement pushed for a 30-hour workweek not as an aspirational goal but as an emergency economic policy. The logic was direct. If there wasn't enough work to go around, spread what work existed across more people. Reduce each person's hours, hire more workers, and use the workweek itself as a tool to fight unemployment. In 1933, the Senate actually passed the Black-Canary Bill, which would have mandated a 30-hour maximum workweek across American industry. The bill's sponsor, Senator Hugo Black of Alabama, later a Supreme Court justice, argued that 30 hours was the only way to distribute employment broadly enough to pull the country out of the Depression. The bill passed the Senate. It was not fringe legislation. Franklin Roosevelt's administration ultimately killed it in the House, partly because business lobbying was fierce, and partly because Roosevelt's own economists believed direct employment programs, the New Deal's public works projects, were a better tool than a mandated hour reduction. The 30-hour week lost not because it was economically absurd, but because it competed with a different theory of how to fix the same problem, and the other theory had more political momentum in that particular moment. If the Black-Canary Bill had cleared the House in 1933, the standard workweek in the United States, and likely in countries that followed American industrial norms, might today be 6 hours shorter. The weekend would still be 2 days, but the workday itself would look completely different. The 5-day, 40-hour week won by defeating a 30-hour alternative that had a Senate majority behind it. So when your alarm goes off on Monday morning, you are living inside a set of decisions made between a Massachusetts textile mill in 1910, a car plant in Dearborn in 1926, a Senate floor in 1933, and a presidential signature in 1938. The 2-day weekend you rely on exists because Jewish immigrant workers needed Friday afternoons, because Henry Ford wanted to sell more cars, and because one piece of legislation narrowly outmaneuvered another. The trace of all of it is visible in the smallest details. The reason Saturday and Sunday are grouped together as the weekend rather than, say, Sunday and Monday, which would make equal mathematical sense, is that the original accommodation was for Friday to Saturday religious observance, and Sunday was already protected. The 2 days landed next to each other because of that specific history, not because the human body recovers better from work in 48-hour consecutive blocks. And the 40-hour threshold in labor law, 8 hours times 5 days, is now so deeply embedded that when researchers and companies experiment with 4-day weeks today, they typically compress 40 hours into 4 days rather than simply reducing total hours. The assumption that 40 hours is the correct amount of work isn't examined. Only the distribution of those hours is up for debate. The number Ford and the Fair Labor Standards Act settled on in the 1930s is still the invisible anchor around which every modern conversation about work-life balance quietly orbits. What looks like a neutral, obvious, almost biological fact, 5 days on, 2 days off, is actually a fossil. The shape of your week is the shape of someone else's negotiation preserved.